Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
All right. Let's see.
New Year.
Happy New Year to you.
Yom Tov Sheni Shagalud.
Okay. We are 61a, about a third of the way down the Mishnah. Okay. Avra Gader Shehu Gavoa Arba Amos. If a fire crosses a boundary, like a fence, a wall that is 4 amos high, which is a height at which you would ordinarily the fire would be contained by it. Odera Harabim, or a public road. A thoroughfare, again, that's expected to stop the spread of a fire on a har or a river, patur. Then the setter of the fire is off the hook, presumably because it is not expected that this would happen. It's an unusual event that the fire would cross this barrier. But Tanya, so Gemara says, well, we have another brisa to the contrary. Avra Gader Shel Gavoa Arba Amos Chayav says exactly the opposite, that if the fire crosses a 4 amma high wall, then you're still liable. How can you square that with our Mishnah? Amar Papa, Tanadidan Kachashiv Milamala Lamata. The ton of our Mishnah is measuring from the top to the bottom. So as follows: Sheish amos pater. If the wall is 6 amos high, then you're off the hook. Chamesh amos pater. 5 amos high, you're still off the hook. Ad arba amos pater. All the way down till 4 amos. You're patur. So that's why he says patur, because he's talking about when are you exempt up till 4 amos. But 4 amos or lower, you are liable. It's kind of like the ad bichlal controversy. Tana bara, but the outside Tana, meaning from the Brisa, milamata lamala kachash. He's talking about how high does it have to be until you become patur. So shtei amos chayav, shalosh amos chayav, 2 amos you're still responsible. If the wall is 3 amos, you're still responsible. Ad arba amos chayav, you're responsible until it hits 4 amos. So the 4 amos is like the boundary between patur and chayav. So one source cites it as you're still chayav, and the other one cites it as you're still patur, which kind of leaves open the question of what if the wall is exactly 4 amos high. Arba amos shamru de patur. The 4 amos that our Mishnah says is patur. Afilu b'stei chatzim. Even if the fire reaches the wall into a thorn field. So I guess like thorns are dry, they catch fire easily. So you're still patur. Amar Rav Papa. Rav Papa says, "Umisfas kotzim ulamala arba amos." That's you're only patur if from the top of the thorns to the top of the wall there's 4 amos. Okay, so if you have a 4 amma wall and 4 amos of thorns behind it, then that can be expected to catch fire. You're only patur if the vertical distance from the top of the thorns to the top of the wall is 4 amos. Amar Rav. Our Mishnah is only talking about the case of a fire that is rising from the ground. If it's a bent over fire. So let's say you have a tree that's on fire with a canopy. So the canopy is the fire is above the wall. Even up to 100 amos, right? Because if the fire is above the wall, then what good is it? How high the wall is? Makes sense. But Shmuel says, actually, no. Our Mishnah is talking about when it says patur, it's still talking about a fire that is bent over or coming from above. So that's when a 4 amma wall is good. But if it's a fire rising from the ground, even a small wall, like a very short wall, should be enough to stop the fire, and therefore you're patur. Presumably, well, let's go see the elaboration. This Tani Kavasi de Rav. We have a support for Rav, but Medvarim Amurim, when do we say the Mishnah is patur? And in this case, we're talking about the public road. So a public road is a certain width, to be defined as a public road, it has to be 16 amos wide. B'kolachos, that's only if it's a fire on the ground. If it's bent over, and there's wood, or fuel available, there is fuel that you could expect would catch fire from this bent over fire. Afilu ad mea mil chayav. Even if the road is like 100 mil wide, you are still liable. So in other words, I mean, as I said, Rav seems to make more sense, because you should judge by the circumstances, right? If it's a case where there's fuel available that is likely to be, seems likely to be caught by the road or by the fire, I'm sorry, then you should be liable. And then Avra Nahara Shlulis, Shehem Rechavim Shmona Amos and Patur. And that Brisa also gives a measure for the river. If it crosses a river, if the river is 8 amos wide, that makes you patur. But if it's less than that, you're still chayav. Derech harabim, the Mishnah says if it crosses a public road, and we've just said 16 amos wide. Montana, who's the author of this Mishnah, Amar Rava, Rabbi Eliezer Heat, Rabbi Eliezer. Now we have another Mishnah, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Sheish Esrei Amos Kederech Reshus Harabim Patur. When it's 16 amos, when you have a 16 amma barrier, which is the measure, which is like a public road, then you're patur. So it doesn't actually have to be a road, but it's just indicating that the road referred to in our Mishnah, which is that's defined as 16 amos or wider, that is what our Mishnah says is patur, and that accords with Rabbi Eliezer in this other source. Onahar, so the Mishnah said a river. Rav Amar Nahar Mamash, it has to be an actual river. Shmuel says Arisa de Dalai, any kind of channel of water, even if you have a ditch, an irrigation canal or channel, that's considered, that's a barrier as well. So according to Rav, who says it has to be a real river, so even if it's a dry riverbed, that's still a barrier. But if Shmuel, who says it's any kind of channel that's been man-made, that's if it has water. But no water, then it's not considered a barrier to the fire. So it seems like an actual river seems like a more significant body of water. So even if there's no water, there's a gap, and presumably with no fuel in it, because it was a riverbed. So I mean, it's also a little strange because I'm sure we've all seen dry riverbeds where there are trees growing and there are other vegetation. So it should be, but perhaps we're talking about a river that is generally flowing, generally has water in it, and it's dried up temporarily and nothing has grown in it. Okay, we mentioned before the word shluli. The brisa that we quoted said Avra Nahar Shluli. If the fire crossed the river or Shluli. What is this? It's not an house, and we have another Mishnah. Ve'elu mafsikin lepeah. These things divide a field regarding peah. So the rule of peah is you have to leave a corner of your field unharvested for the poor. Now, what if you have property that is in multiple plots, right? So does each one have a corner, or does one corner suffice for all of them together? So this is the rule. If there is a division between the two parts of your field that we're going to describe, then they're considered two fields, and each one needs a payout. If there isn't no such division, even if there's a bit of a gap or it's irregularly shaped or something, then one corner suffices. So what are these divisions for payah? Hanachal, a wadi or ravine, a shlulit, we'll see what that is. V'derech hayachid, a private road, meaning less than 16 amma. V'derech harabim, on a public road. My shlulit. So what is a shlulit? Amar Rav Amar Shmuel, Makom Shemei Geshamim Sholin Sham. It's like puddles. It's like depressions in the ground where rainwater collects. So it's deep enough to collect water, then it is considered a division of the field. Which isn't very deep, right? But presumably it's like where nothing is planted there. So if it's completely flat land, then it still could be the same field. But if there's this depression in between, interrupting it, then it's two fields. Or Bibi Amar what he has a different definition of shlulis. Amasamayim, it means an aqueduct, a carrier of water. Shemechalekas, or a channel of water. Shemechalekas shalal agapeh. Why is it called shluis? Because it distributes bounty, shalal, which is like the word for booty in war. It delivers wealth, bounty on its banks, right? So that's the water channel that brings the irrigation water. Obviously, is gives life to the field around it, to the earth around it. So now, so we have two different, so we have the puddle and the channel as possible definitions of shluis. If you say it's a puddle, so certainly an irrigation channel is deeper than that, so that's certainly included as a division. But if you say that shluis means a channel, but a depression that causes a puddle, that's not sufficient. That's not as deep or as much of a division as a channel. Because that doesn't count. Bagne de Aramikra, they're just called bowls of the land. Like I said, we would call a depression in the earth. Okay, next Mishnah. Hamadli k'b'toch shelo. If you light a fire in your own property, ad kama tavar adleika. Like, what's the expectation for how far the fire can be expected to spread over ground where there's no fuel? So, in other words, if my property abuts against your property and I light a fire and it spreads into your property, obviously that's something that should be foreseen. But what if there's a gap, like a fire barrier, as it were, a gap of land where there's no fuel? How wide would that have to be in order for me to say, I lit the fire on my own property, it was a freak accident that it crossed into your property because there was this gap? So how wide does such a gap have to be? Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah Omer, Roinos Akiluhu be'emtza base car. You consider yourself lighting the fire as in the middle of a base car, which is we've seen that in Shabbos a lot. 274 square amma. Rabbi Elazar Omer, Sheshes Amos Kader Chashus Rabin. Rabbi Elazar says, no, just 16 amos. Well, why should this be any different than a public road, which is considered a barrier? Rabbi Akiva Omer Chamishim amos. Akiva says 50 amos, and the Gemara will examine all of these views. Rabbi Shimon Omer Shalem Hamaviras Habeira Hakol Lefi Adleika. Since the Torah says the one who lights the fire is responsible, it means when there's responsibility. So it's not a question of distance, it's a question of circumstance and what are the conditions when you lit the fire. There's no hard and fast rule of how wide that should be. Although the previous Mishnah, said, established some standards. So we'll see what the Gemara does with this. So V'leisle Rabbi Shimon Shiura B'dleika. So there's a question I just asked. Does Rabbi Shimon, doesn't he think there were standards? That's not, but we have a Mishnah. Adam Tanur B'toch Havayis. We could have just quoted the Mishnah before us, but here's another source. A person should not set up an oven in a house. There has to be some headspace above the oven, 4 amos, so that the fire in the oven doesn't set the building on fire.
First example in history of a building code.
Building code, that's right. If you're building your oven on the second floor, You can't have it. You can't have a thin ceiling or floor. The division, the ceiling slash floor between the first and second floor. You can't have a. There are standards for how thick that floor has to be for the oven to sit on, and that is 3 tvachim. Ubekira. What if it's so? That's an oven. What about a stove? A stove top tefach. It only has to be 1 tefach. It doesn't get as hot. Bimhizik. If you observe the building code, but it still causes damage to the house, then mishalem mashi, you have to pay. Of course, if it's your own house, you're not paying yourself. We're talking about if a fire starts because of your, despite the fact that you adhered to the building code, the fire starts because you're using your oven, then Mishalim Masi, you pay for what you damaged. In other words, you're not really necessarily off the hook. Rabbi Shimon Omer lo namru shirin halalu. Rabbi Shimon says these standards were only stated elashim hizik patrim ilashalim. No, that makes sense. Like, why have standards if you're still going to be responsible? If there's standards, that means that this is considered a safe standard, and so that should get you off the hook, according to Rabbi Shimon. Amar of Nachman, Amar Rabba Baragua. So Rav Nachman restates this. Hakol fi gova hadleka. Rav Shimon means depends on how high the fire is. So in other words, Rabbi Shimon does say that if you observe the building code, you're off the hook. You're not liable for damage to your neighbor. But it depends. Like if it's a really big fire that you start in your oven, and then that's not what the building code was designed to protect against. So you deliberately, if you leave your oven on broil for all day, then you're still responsible. So that's what he means by everything depends on how big the fire is. Amar of Yosef, Amar of Yidam Shmuel. Halacha Rabbi Shimon. We follow Rabbi Shimon. Halacha Rabbi Shimon. We follow Rabbi Shimon. Okay. Hamad likas hagadish. The next Mishnah. If you light a fire of produce, you've got your wheat stacked up, and you set it on fire. And something was hidden inside it, and they burned. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Mishali Masha B'tocha. You have to pay for what was inside it. So this is the question of tamun, which we've seen before, that things that are hidden and get destroyed by fire, like you couldn't see them because of the tall whatever, because it wasn't visible. So this is the machlokas that we've been talking about. Rabbi Yehuda says you're still responsible. Chachamim Omrim ein mishalem al gadish shel chitin o shel sarin. You only pay for you burn a stack of wheat, even with something inside it, you pay for a stack of wheat. And we'll see some details about that in the Gemara. So what if there was a goat tied up to the stack of grain? The Evet Samaklo, or there was a slave near the stack of grain, V'nisrafimo, and that got destroyed by the fire. Chayev, then you are responsible, because this is not a case of where it's hidden. Eved, and we'll see, like, what about the Eved? The Eved, the problem is that if you kill somebody, then you're no longer responsible for financial damages. You're responsible for criminal damages, or I should say for criminal punishment. So you would be off the hook for civil liability for the value of the Eved. Eved kafuslo, but what if the slave is tied up, is bound to the stack of gedi samachlo, or a goat that's nearby but not tied to it, and they get burned? Potter, then you are. Sorry, I stated that wrong, right? The slave. Evet Samachlo, you're chayav, because the Evet should have run away. So you're not responsible in the capital sense or in the criminal sense, but you're still responsible. Perhaps the fire was too too fast approaching, or for whatever reason the slave was unable to escape. So criminally you're not liable, but civilly, monetarily you are liable. But if the slave is tied up, then you're patur because you're liable for murder. And you're off the hook for financial damages. And the goat, if the goat is only nearby, then the goat should have run away, right? Then you're not responsible. Umodim Chacham Rabbi Yehuda, but the rabbis agree with Rabbi Yehuda that Tamun is chayav. But madli kasabira, if you set fire to a castle, then you pay for everything. Because when you set fire to my house, it's not just my house that's going to burn down. I've got all my stuff in there, so that stuff is in there. That's not really hidden. That you have to assume that whatever is in there is going to be damaged as well, and therefore you are responsible, even according to the rabbis. So it's only where things are unexpectedly hidden that you're, according to the rabbis, you're patur. Amar of Kamma, Gemara says, where Kana says, "Machlokas v'madlik b'toch shala." When do they have a dispute? When you light the fire in your own property, and it accidentally spreads to someone else's property. Rabbi Yehuda says you are responsible for hidden things that are damaged in that case. The rabbis say no, you're off the hook. But if you directly light the fire in your neighbor's property, then everybody agrees you're chayav for tamun. Because you deliberately set my stuff on fire, you assume responsibility for everything that's there. It's not an accidental spread. Amalei Rava, so Rava says, if that's the case, Adatani Seifa, Modim Chacham Rabbi Yehuda, Modim Sabira. The Mishnah brings a case where the rabbis agree with Rabbi Yehuda or admit to Rabbi Yehuda that it's if you're lighting a house on fire, then you're still response. So they agree with Rabbi Yehuda that tamun is not a factor. Because that's what you should expect. Listening today, you should, since you're already listing cases where the rabbis give in to Rabbi Yehuda, agree with Rabbi Yehuda, it should have said in the Mishnah, when do the rabbis say that you're patur for tamun b'malik shalo? Only if you're lighted in your own property, on the fire spreads to your neighbor's property. But if you light the fire directly in your friend's property, then the rabbis would agree. So, if you're going to say that that's also a case where the rabbis agree with Rabbi Yehuda, then since the Mishnah is already listing cases where the rabbis agree with Rabbi Yehuda, then it should have listed this as well. So it's questionable if that's correct that the rabbis give in to Rabbi Yehuda when you light in your own property. So Rav answers, there's two things that they're disagreeing about.